Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session. My name is Sophia Fernandez, and I'm the Senior Technical Advisor, Political Inclusion at the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our event today. This is the launch of our last, but certainly not least, paper in the WFD Anti-Corruption and Integrity series. And this paper looks at the links between gender and anti-corruption initiatives. The research paper we're presenting today asks three key questions. How do women influence the level of corruption at different levels of government? How does corruption hinder the political participation of women? What conditions are required for women to be a force for anti-corruption? At WFD, we've been building the evidence for the importance of women's political leadership in both formal and informal spaces, as we have found that women are fundamentally changing the face of international relations and politics, resulting in more equal, inclusive, and healthier societies, and also the evidence for the need for more gender-sensitive governments. WFD's board member, Maria Miller MP, the former Minister for Equalities in the UK, has a piece today on our website that nicely summarises this evidence, and we'll be sharing a link to that as well. So today I'm really pleased to welcome, joining me today, my panel, Dr. Ocean Merkler from UNU Merit and its Maastricht Graduate School of Governance, who authored the paper. Ocean has an established academic career investigating the relationship between gender and corruption, and so was in an excellent position to bring that experience to this work. Also joining me today is Franklin de Vries, WFD's Senior Governance Advisor, who leads this portfolio in WFD, and Marina Rudenko, Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Advisor, who's based in Ukraine. So today we'll start with Dr. Merkler presenting the findings of the paper and some of the case studies that she looked into. And then we'll move into a discussion between our panelists. And then we also invite you, our attendees, to join us in the discussion via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll have the opportunity to present some of those questions to the panelists as well. Just to let you all know that this event is being recorded and will be shared on our website later today. And we're also on Twitter, so at WFD_democracy, so feel free to join our conversation online as well. So to start, I'll hand over to Orchun, if you could start, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me today. So I'll just kind of run you quite quickly through the findings of the paper, and I really look forward to discussing then a little bit more afterwards. So I'll give you a quick overview of the current kind of academic debate, and then also give you some insights on the three case studies that we included in the paper, which were Kenya, Indonesia, and Ukraine. So looking at the relationship between gender and corruption, in particular political participation of women in corruption, really started off in 2001, where the first papers emerged that were looking at this relationship, and they found that countries with higher rates of female representation in politics had lower levels of corruption. And while the discussion around gender and corruption has since moved on to also include other questions, such as the different effects of corruption on men and women, or the role of gendered forms of corruption, such as extortion, the large amount of research really focuses on this relationship between female participation in politics and levels of corruption. And this finding that larger numbers of women in parliaments are linked to lower levels of corruption was quickly picked up by agencies like the World Bank, that then identify gender equality as an important tool to curb corruption. But since then, a multitude of studies have confirmed that this relationship really holds true for women in elected office at national level, at regional level, at cabinet level, in local councils, but also that the relationship is not an easy and straightforward one, that if we increase the number of women, we automatically lower levels of corruption. So three main questions that Sophia already hinted at kind of emerged out of this first initial findings. And that is, how do women influence the level of corruption at different levels of government? The second one is then, how does corruption potentially hinder the political participation of women? And the last one is, how can women be a successful anti-corruption force? So I'll go through these questions in the same order. So first, this is where really the majority of focus of the existing research is how do women influence the level of corruption at different levels of government, right? And as I said, we found that research found that this relationship is true in many different contexts. The relationship between high levels of participation and lower levels of corruption is particularly strong in contexts of high accountability, and especially in consolidated democracies. And as I said, the underlying reasons are still debated, but there are some possible explanations that have been identified why this relationship exists. The first and kind of most simplistic explanation was that there's simply a difference in how women and men, the attitude, of women and men towards corruption. And this was really what the first studies hypothesized, right? And different reasons were given for this, such as women being more likely to sacrifice personal gains for the common good, differences in self-controls between the genders, differences in willingness to engage in interactions with criminals, risk aversion that is different, or women simply being less likely to engage in criminal behavior overall. And this was shortly very popular as the so-called fairer sex hypothesis, saying, oh, women are just less corrupt. But since then, we kind of moved away from this and realized that this is not always the case, and there's much more nuance to that relationship. So the focus quickly changed to looking at more what role institutional factors could play as a mitigating factor in the relationship between political participation of women and corruption. And here, one argument that was put forth was simply that functioning liberal institutions simply allow more women to participate in the process. And at the same time, these functional liberal institutions also lead to lower levels of corruption. It might even be the case, as some research argues, that only less corrupt governments actually are willing to include more women in decision-making roles. For example, because they're less based on tight networks. Women often also simply have less access to corrupt opportunities, right? We well know that women often don't have the same access to power positions as men do. So by definition, this makes the abuse of power, so corruption, a lot more difficult for women. And studies also show that women in politics face other risks, as voters often are less forgiving of missteps when they're taken by women. However, interestingly, this seems to also be changing, but there is more research coming out yet. Also interesting is the reverse relationship, right? So what kind of impact does corruption have on political representation of women? And this has also been quite widely researched, and we know that a political career is full of opportunities, but also obstacles, especially for women. And more research shows that corruption can be one of those obstacles. It can be a barrier because women just don't have the illicit funds that are needed to run an election, for example. It can also be that in the selection within parties, they're often kind of dominated by male networks that are kind of trying to secure their corruption rents, so they don't allow women to access this office. And in general, clientelism has been an effective gatekeeper to hinder women from entering formal politics, and this has been shown in different studies. But for example, one study looking at Argentina and the Federal Congress showed that women members of Congress are more likely to represent political parties that are less associated with clientelistic networks. What is good to know for also anti-corruption efforts is that the exclusion from women from clientelistic networks also means that oftentimes female politicians have a different support base, so because they start their careers in civil society, which then also makes them more likely to be anti-corruption champions. So quickly, this already brings us to the last question, which is what role can women really play in anti-corruption? And the short answer is lots of different roles. Of course they can, but practice has shown that female politicians and activists often tend to raise different issues concerning women's rights, child protection, well-being of disadvantaged groups. And this is especially relevant also for anti-corruption initiatives, right? Because then greater attention is paid to improvements, for example, in service delivery, which leads to more oversight, which then also leads to lower corruption. However, it's always important to keep in mind that the mere presence of women does not always have the intended effect, right? If women aren't actually given decision-making authority, or they're part of the same corrupt networks as men are, their effect, of course, won't be much on lowering levels of corruption. So it's important to not just look at increasing the number of women involved, but always to also consider what kind of women are involved in politics. In line with what I said before, women also often have more female voters as their support base, which again focuses more on women's interests and then often leads to more transparency in public service delivery. Two important issues that we can discuss here is for one, candidate selection, and the other one is quotas, right? That can have an impact on how women can be an anti-corruption force. For one is we know that discrimination against women candidates often leads to them having to work extra hard or be better than, or actually be exceptionally talented to make a career in politics. So this might explain why women often are that are in politics, often have a different views on corruption than their male counterparts. It might also be that women are simply because they're women ascribed certain traits such as being more nurturing and caring, and might be perceived to be less corrupt and not as actually be less corrupt. And an important aspect is that quotas have been a really good measure to increase the number of women on the political stage. But if we look at quotas and the effect on anti-corruption, the evidence is really mixed, right? So for example, a study from Uganda showed that quotas were really used as a way to control the women in politics, and elites kind of use quotas to select only compliant women. And this, of course, then had no effect on actually breaking up corrupt networks. So in this case, quotas would not have a positive effect on anti-corruption, even though the number of women has increased. So this is one really important takeaway, that of course, if we only increase the number of malleable women to fill spots, political spots, then we will not see a large effect on anti-corruption efforts. So I know this was a very quick overview, but I'm happy to discuss some of this further in the Q&A. Let's also have a quick look at the country case study. So for all of these countries, there's no kind of comprehensive research on the relationship, but there is evidence that, of course, also in these countries, there is a clear relationship between the two. What is interesting for the case of Ukraine, so let me start there, is that there two large anti-corruption elections have resulted in a much higher number of female MPs as well, particularly the 2009 election that was largely won on an anti-corruption platform has almost doubled the number of women in parliament, right? So this is also an indication of this existing relationship. Of course, we still need to see if this increased number of women actually leads to lower levels of corruption. But there are certain elements that can already be highlighted. For example, that in 2020, Irina Venediktova was appointed as the prosecutor general, which is the first time the Ukraine has a woman chairing the prosecutor's general office. And of course, it's too recent to establish any effect, but she's been pushing for certain initiatives, for example, more merit-based hiring that the literature shows have a large effect both on more women involvement, but also a positive effect on lowering corruption. Also, as we discussed, of course, we know that oftentimes women in politics bring these different issues to the table and lead to lowering levels of corruption in service delivery, for example. So it remains to be seen if that's the case also in Ukraine. An interesting study also showed that women are less likely to take money from, as the question phrased it in the survey, unscrupulous candidates when they're running for election. So this will also be interesting to see if that translates then into a less involvement in corruption of these female MPs. What is also, I think, interesting to highlight is that a small study with focus groups in 2014, so it's not the newest, but still found that people perceive that women are not necessarily less corrupt, but simply have less access to corrupt opportunities in Ukraine. And again, now that there's more women in parliament, it will be interesting to kind of see how that translates. Quickly, because I'm already a bit over time, to Kenya. Kenya similarly has slowly increasing participation rates of women and rampant levels of corruption, but that does not mean that there's no link between anti-corruption and political participation. There's two studies one that really interestingly shows that corruption really hinders women from entering politics, as they just don't have the financial means to buy a vote or bribe to get into seats. And also that despite having more women in parliament, also due to the gender quota, women are still not seen as fit for leadership, despite being successful in it. And these male-dominated patronage networks that exist in Kenya still very much exclude women from the political decision-making sphere. One interesting study that I found was a PhD that was looking at women's leadership in Nairobi county, and they found that there seems to be no difference in perceptions about corruption between genders, but that women simply don't have the resources to engage in corruption in the political sphere as much. And also highlights how many female anti-corruption champions do exist in Kenya, so that they really do play a really important role. So there should be more research done on that. And then lastly, again, very shortly, is the case study of Indonesia, where women's participation in politics is very low and corruption is a continued major problem. What I think is especially important here to keep in mind is that, of course, even more so than in other places, women are not a homogeneous group, so interests and roles will differ very much. But also Indonesia is dominated very much by a rent-seeking patronage network, which can be a risk and an opportunity for the involvement of women, right? On the one hand, it could be that we know from research that these patronage networks very much restrict access to women. At the same time, a higher number of women could really help kind of disrupt and break up these patronage networks, and therefore the corruption that's associated with it. And what is also interesting that not all of these networks are male dominated. So the one study that looked at the 2017 election in North Aceh actually found that those candidates who used women-centered networks of brokers were particularly successful. So, and what is interesting is that these brokers not only developed their own networks, but then used this power to pressure candidates to really campaign for more women-friendly policies. And this, of course, could also be interesting to see how this kind of same mechanisms might be used for anti-corruption efforts. And I think what the example of Indonesia really nicely shows is that it's really important to focus not only on women at the highest level of politics, which I think we're often tempted to do, but also really focusing on the important role women can play at lower levels, at local levels, not just in kind of furthering more women in politics or in the political sphere in general, but also in anti-corruption efforts. So I'll leave it here because I already went over my time and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Audrey. And of course, our paper is also available on our website, and so people can take their time to digest the findings. But thank you very much for that. What we'll do now is we'll have a little bit of a discussion with our panelists on your findings, but I also encourage those who are attending to please put your questions in the chat. We're very happy to take them, in the Q&A function. We're very happy to take them as we go. But to start off, Audrey, you presented, I think the findings very clearly show that there is a key role to be played by women's political leaders at various levels of governments. And it's equally important to think about ways to address the barriers to women's political participation, because they do have an effect on addressing corruption, but also an effect on leading towards more gender sensitive governments. So maybe I'll actually start with Franklin by asking you, what does this mean for the way that international development partners or people who work in this space and in how they should approach efforts to address corruption?
Yes, thank you, Sophia. Good afternoon, everyone, and congratulations to Artrun for the excellent paper and research. So the main point I want to make this afternoon is in response to this question that the nature of corruption is transnational and political, and so should be our approach in combating corruption. So what does this mean in concrete terms? In today's globalized world, there is bribery across borders, misuse of international financial systems, and abuse of democratic institutions to advance anti-democratic aims. But there have also been some very interesting revelations through investigative journalism projects such as the Pandora Papers. And these Pandora Papers have documented the extent to which the legal system in wealthy countries is used by corrupt actors to launder illicit money. And so therefore, anti-corruption interventions are unlikely to promise simple solutions, because we do deal with complex, deeply entrenched economic political challenges. So with vested interests and political careers at stake, tackling corruption is hard. Now, one of the reasons why anti-corruption efforts had limited effects over these last 30 years is that they have been state-centric. So they focused on the development in one country, in one's own country, whereas corruption is a fundamentally transnational, international phenomenon. And I think that is demonstrated well by the Pandora Papers. And in addition, for too long, combating corruption has been treated as a matter of technocratic projects aimed at building the knowledge and the skills of specialist stakeholders. But combating corruption doesn't work that way. It's not about building capacity and expertise only, though that is part of it. It's about much more. It is actually about changing the societal context and changing the legal environment. So changing the society context means, for instance, making it politically damaging for governments and politicians to, for instance, hamper transparency of financial transactions. And changing the legal environment, for instance, means making it legally untenable for real estate agents, accountants, financial advisors to act as professional enablers of this transnational corruption. Now, at WFD, we have done some recent research and we have looked at how to rethink anti-corruption strategies. And so we have argued that anti-corruption reforms need to focus more on incentives and pressure points to ensure that acting against corruption becomes politically unavoidable and necessary. Or alternatively, that high political costs are generated if one abstains from acting against corruption. So in other words, tackling the corruption requires a more political approach. But it also means that there is need for building more flexibility into anti-corruption initiatives so that we can respond to unexpected openings as well as to democratic backsliding. And I want to give a concrete example what this means in practice. We've looked at, for instance, the bribery legislation in 3 countries, in Kenya, Ukraine, and Indonesia. And in one of these countries, in Indonesia, we noted that the bribery legislation, for instance, lacked a definition of a foreign public official and lacked provisions against bribing a foreign public official. That was not forbidden. So when Parliament debates and passes this legislation and is alerted on this gap, a political approach to combating corruption requires identifying the interests at stake in closing this gap and see which are the pressure points which can be used in doing so. And there, of course, researchers and civil society and investigative journalists play an important role in this network to close the gap. And then a second and final example is actually here in the UK. So for 5 years, the government has been promising a register on foreign owners of UK property, currently hidden often behind offshore companies, but this public registry is not happening. So when I was watching the news about the protests in Kazakhstan against corruption, among others, I also realized that the Kazakh elite has put a lot of its wealth into UK property. So a political approach to combating corruption here requires identifying the interests at stake in closing this gap in the UK legislative framework. So these are two examples and some of my thinking in response to your question, Sophia. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Franklin. It's a lot to consider. But speaking about examples in the approach towards addressing corruption, Marina, maybe I could turn to you to talk a bit about that sort of parallel approach in the Ukraine.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, colleagues. I appreciate Dr. Orton, the research and focus on Ukraine, because it's really important. And in case of Ukraine, we could observe that gender mainstreaming to the different kinds of reform, including security sector, social services provision, economic development, and anti-corruption reform, they were started simultaneously and were advocated by civil society based on the international commitments of Ukraine in different areas, including women's rights, because Ukraine ratified CEDAW conventions 40 years ago. It's Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and women civil society organization advocates for changes, including this area. In 2017, CEDAW committee provided Ukraine a number of concluding observations, including recommendations to the government to focus on protection of women activists from different areas, including anti-corruption. And unfortunately, we have a case of Katerina Handyuk, who were moderate due to her anti-corruption activity. And this investigation is not proper investigated, unfortunately, and there is a lack of reform in security sector. But we could observe that all these activities in gender mainstreaming, anti-corruption, they were started after the revolution of dignity, and it was a demand of society to focus at the requirements of EU-Ukraine Agreement Association, which has a number of directives to implement, including in the area of gender equality. And many anti-corruption institutions were established, as well as the national mechanism on gender equality were strengthened. For example, Vice Prime Minister on European and Euro-Atlantic integration was the duties of these positions were extended with the gender equality. So this person is responsible for the EU integration of Ukraine. The EU integration has a strong part of anti-corruption activities, and the same person is responsible for gender mainstreaming. So I agree with Dr. Orton that gender mainstreaming and transparency of governments mean strengthening of anti-corruption activities. And the number of women increased as representatives at the parliament of Ukraine, at the local level, and we could observe some, unfortunately, some negative results of gender quotas when women were elected to the local councils, but after the elections they were forced to refuse from the mandate due to political corruption. So yes, we have some progress in Ukraine on gender mainstreaming and development of anti-corruption institutions and civil society organizations working in the area of anti-corruption. Representatives of the reanimation package of reform, the most part of them are women-led. And many anti-corruption initiatives were started as civil society initiatives, and women participated in these activities, but we do need to think how to protect women activists because they could be attacked differently as men activists, and many international partners conduct trainings for women activists how to report corruption. But the mechanisms of protection of people who report the corruption is very weak in Ukraine, unfortunately. But it has a strong gender component. Yeah, so this is my answer.
Thank you. Thanks, Marina. I do agree with your point about also thinking through the consequences of some of the work and leading some of this work in the context that we're talking about. But Orçun, would you like to come in on that point as well?
Sorry. Yes, and I think it's a little bit along similar lines of thinking about consequences, but more thinking about consequences of our initiatives and how we phrase things. So thinking about, I did my PhD work on Georgia and political participation and corruption there. And one of the things that I found really interesting is that, so, you know, international community was pushing for, and also civil society was pushing for more women to be active and also saying, okay, they're a source for anti-corruption, we should push this forward. And one major argument was used was this women bring different issues to the table, right? But then listening to kind of the political elites that were active, mostly, of course, men, right, at the time, this was quickly turned into an argument to push women into a specific corner, right? So they were responsible for children, women, and not real politics, right? So I think sometimes these arguments that we use can then be kind of twisted into restricting women in a different area. So I think I just want to highlight that it's important that we think about, you know, while we argue and that it's important to include women for all these different reasons, we pay constant attention that doesn't lead to women being forced to then focus only on these things, right? Because while we want women to focus on anti-corruption, we also want to them to focus on security and finance and, you know, any sector in politics. So I just found that a really important kind of little remark, because I also noticed myself that I use the same arguments over and over again, and have to remind myself that, you know, sometimes it's important to take a step back and think, you know, what else could we use as an argument to make sure that we don't restrict political space for women instead of expanding it. So.
Exactly, and how to facilitate women to be anti-corruption champions alongside men, and have men on board as well to be anti-corruption champions, and understand that there's a gendered you know, consequence to the impacts of corruption. Marina, can I come to you on that question about engaging civil society as anti-corruption champions, and where you've seen from your experience examples of politically active women being an anti-corruption force?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, Ukraine established a number of institutions which could guarantee investigation, but another and good example is institutions responsible for the transparent procurement at the local and country level. And these institutions provide additional opportunities for civil society activists, both men and women, to control, to monitor the public procurements and report the proper implementation of the legislation or some I don't know, corrupted activities. And Transparency International, other civil society organizations which are united to the coalition of anti-corruption organizations, they started to train civil society activists how to monitor, report, how to submit complaints to the prosecutors and different yeah, so then it was established a monitoring platform for civil society, how to submit the cases and share experiences between different civil society organizations. But as I said, so we have increased number of trained people how to report, how to monitor, but due to some lack in proper investigation at the prosecution level, at the justice level, we have a lack of examples, and as Dr. Orton said during her presentation, we have a lack of data. So we cannot now analyze and say that women are more active in reporting anti-corruption or anti-corruption activists use gender-related arguments for monitoring corruption. For example, in case of transparent corruption, we could buy equipment, more equipment for the health services, for the hospital at the local level, and it will be as colleague said already, as women are more responsible for the children, for health conditions of family members, because due to some gender bias, men in Ukraine how to say, seek for the health prevention, health problem prevention more or less than women. So we know that this better procurement for hospitals will be more interested for men at the women at the local level than men. Yeah, so we need more deeper research in this area to understand is there any changes or no, we cannot report. So we cannot say that men, women are more active in reporting, in investigation. Yeah, but we, as I said, what is really important in Ukraine to strengthen the mechanism of protection of people reporting the corruption, because it sometimes due to threats faced by anti-corruption activists, and women are faced gender-based threats, so like violence, some threat for their families, children, especially at the local level, they could avoid the reporting. So these negative consequences should be taken into account during the training session, during the work with police officers, how to protect women and how to understand this gender based violence for anti-corruption activists, women activists.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think that's certainly a gap that we're seeing from the discussion here today when we talk about international approaches, international development approaches to addressing corruption. A lot of the time it's focusing on transparency, on accountability, training, but not on changing the enabling environment for this to actually function in a way that's safe for all participants.
Absolutely.
And just on that, one of the pieces of research, Ocean, that you highlighted in the paper, which I thought was very interesting, was about, again, at local level, for example, the effects of mayors, women mayors, and on anti-corruption efforts, and this sort of phenomena that's being seen in elected positions, just going away from civil society and back into sort of the formal political space, that there's a tendency to see strong anti-corruption efforts in formal spaces during the sort of first term of a woman's political career. I was wondering if you could point to that, and then we'll talk a little bit further about the formal political space, about parliaments and their role.
Yeah, so the study you're referring to is about French mayors, and the researchers found that when they're first elected, they do have an impact on reducing corruption risks. However, when they're re-elected, that effect disappears, and I think that's really interesting for two reasons. For one, it speaks for this, coming in new, you break up networks and you bring in a kind of a new ideas. But then the interesting question is, what changes, right? Is it that it gets really difficult, more and more difficult or that you just kind of get sucked into being part of the network that exists, or that other things take over? So I think there's lots of things to consider, but yeah, that's an interesting study, that this first, when you're the newbie, kind of, then the effect is larger than when you're an incumbent. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And maybe I'll turn to Franklin then about the role of parliaments in combating corruption. And actually, I'll just keep it as broad as that, because I know that you'll have a lot to say.
Yes, thank you, Sophia. Indeed, there is a lot to say on parliaments and parliamentarians and their role in combating corruption and building an integrity system. And of course, it has been advocated on many occasions in various platforms, but I would probably point at a couple of key issues, maybe 6 things I would like to highlight. And the first foremost is, of course, the importance of enacting the accountability legislation. And in general, I think they are the big 4. There are 4 big accountability legislations, which are well known. The first is around campaign and party financing legislation. Second is bribery legislation, which I mentioned earlier. The third one is around money laundering, and the fourth one is around transparency and beneficial ownership transparency legislation. So these are the 4 main themes in terms of accountability legislation, and that's the first thing. And we see that quite a number of parliaments do take this thing forward. But then the second, beyond these legislations, there are so many other pieces of legislations on any social and economic theme, and there it's important to look at corruption proofing of legislation. So that means checking, verifying what are the corruption risks embedded in this new piece of legislation, and how can we reduce that. The third area, which is also well known, is watching the execution of the budget of government, but I would add to that also public enterprises, because a lot of public enterprises can really be generators of patterns of non-accountability, of non-transparency. And in addition, I think particularly in the context of COVID-19, we see that quite a number of parliaments have conducted inquiries into the use of public funds for emergency medical equipment, but also public funds for contracts related to economic recovery. So there is a lot to be digged up there in terms of combating corruption. The fourth one, I think, for Parliament specifically, is establishing a transparent system of the budget of Parliament itself, the remuneration of the members, code of conduct and ethics. So the key issue here is for Parliament to lead by example. Citizens are watching and how Parliament is upholding its own norms and how it is organized is a key issue. And then the fifth, which is coming back regularly as well, is the national anti-corruption strategies, which often Parliament is debating and adopting and keeping it under review. And it's an important element. And I'm currently reviewing national anti-corruption strategies in a couple of countries. And I was looking at one Balkan country and one European neighborhood countries. Now, these strategies, they are, I would say, solid. They refer to integrity, accountability in the public sector, transparency in recruitment, human resources policies. But I also noted one specific gap. And in these anti-corruption strategies, there was not a single word about gender in relation to anti-corruption strategies. And I think Ortrun today has demonstrated the importance of this, because an anti-corruption strategy could, for instance, look at increasing women in political positions with a view to breaking up corrupt male-dominated networks. So it is important to include the gender lens on the national anti-corruption strategies. And then sixthly, finally, the functioning relationship of Parliament with independent oversight institutions, audit institutions, but also anti-corruption agencies. And we have done some multi-country reviews for Asia, Europe, and Africa regions. How do parliaments interact with anti-corruption agencies? And I mean, one of the things we've learned is that Parliament can do much better job in following up to the annual and the other reports of anti-corruption agencies in terms of findings and recommendations. But then there is one other thing which we have noted, which is relevant here, I think, today, is the different practices in terms of the recruitment of the leadership of these institutions. And we see, for instance, that when there are boards or councils with whom the anti-corruption agencies work, that very often a gender lens with regards to the inclusion of women in these leadership positions of these boards and councils is often missing, or at least it's invisible. I haven't noticed it. So again, that is an issue which is important, because we speak here about the cornerstones of the accountability infrastructure. And then in terms of parliamentary approach to anti-corruption, the last thing I would like to say is that probably one of the most innovative things which currently exists on parliamentary approaches is the legislation on global Magnitsky sanctions. So meaning that human rights violators and corrupt officials are being targeted by ensuring that their bank accounts are being frozen, or that they are denied entry into the country. So these are adopting and promoting and reviewing this kind of legislation, I think, is key for a strong parliamentary role in anti-corruption. So these were the kind of things which I wanted to highlight on this occasion. Thanks.
Thanks, Franklin. And I shouldn't feel cynical that anti-corruption strategies are not gender sensitive, but I think it's an opportunity, isn't it, for the investment in this space in the future by international development partners and academics to really push for there to be a consideration that these are not delinked. These are very much interconnected. I'm wondering, Ortrun or Marina, would you like to come in on any of those points that Franklin has been making? Marina.
Yeah, if I may, yeah. So I do support all points of Franklin, but what is the most closest for me? So Ukrainian government has submitted the anti-corruption strategy, and it was voted in the first reading by the parliament in September 2021, and it doesn't contain any gender sensitive wording or obligations, despite Ukraine ratified UN Convention on Anti-Corruption and CEDA, and both of them refer to the intersectionality of the efforts, and it's important to take into account and international and national commitments. Law of Ukraine on equal rights and opportunities demands the gender legal expertise of the drafts of law, and I know that the Westminster Foundation for Democracy provided some consultancy for the Parliament of Ukraine how to conduct this expertise, and other organizations and USAID provided many consultancies and trained people, but the yeah, we need to have these clear mechanisms, and it's important to see this intersectionality and linkages between activities and last week I guess I heard that the first Vice Speaker of the Parliament said that they will focus on the gender legal expertise, and it's really important because we have the mechanism of in the Parliament of two gender subcommittees on human rights and foreign affairs of the Parliament, but unfortunately, other committees don't see gender component at the legislation, and it's a great opportunity, as Sophia said, that it's an opportunity. Let's be positive and see the opportunities in these efforts, and of course, accounting chamber of Ukraine has some opportunities to analyze public budgeting, spending of public budgets with a gender lens. Yeah. So there are a lot of opportunities, of course, and we need just to realize existing legislation or realize commitments of Ukraine. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marina. We're also open for questions from our participants, and we will be going until 1:15, just for those that are with us. We've got a question here about being interested to hear more about how and where to engage political parties on these important issues. Advocacy for gender equality within political parties is often perceived as an external agenda, but as we've been outlining today, there's a very strong business case for looking at the quality of governance in society from the entry point of political parties. So just a question to the panel, how to approach this, or how do we create a stronger case for connecting candidate selection processes with ultimately better societal outcomes? Orchun, would you like to take that first?
Sure. I think the first is to think about, or to make it clearer also, the benefits to the political parties of having more women, not just from an anti-corruption perspective, but especially also from an anti-corruption perspective. And I think one of the first things is to also raise awareness that these networks exist, and that they and think about how we can make them more inclusive. And I think that's particularly in the parties an important question, right? And to highlight how this focus on kind of old boys networks, for lack of better term, really hinders success also of political parties, and also for new generations that maybe have a different interest also. And I think the other thing is to go away from making this the kind of work of women, right? It often we put the effort to do this work on women, and I think there we should have much more focus on the importance of including men in this, but also how making more inclusive a party for women also is beneficial to men, right? This can be anything from, say, mentoring programs, which is also beneficial for say young men who don't come from a background that they're used to acting in a political sphere, or having meetings during times that allow for caring responsibilities, is not just for young mothers, it's also for young fathers. So making sure that creating this or highlighting how creating this inclusive environment is good for everyone, not just for women, and also putting the responsibility of fighting for this more inclusive environment and for fighting for the inclusion for women, also making that the responsibility of the men that are in power at the moment, right? We can't always put the responsibility on the marginalized group alone. And of course, we should also take it a step further and say it's not, of course, enough to think about including women. What I said before is important to think about what women are included, right? And this can be minority women, it can be queer women, it can be, religious minorities. So trying to link this also to a more diverse set of MPs or a set of candidates, that then also and highlighting how that impacts positively the kind of policies that that come out of Parliament. I think that's an important point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the sometimes it can be. I mean, when we work in this sector, you hear all the stories about the ways that political parties work to actively prevent women from being successful within their own party, let alone in other parties. And that in of itself is a form of corruption, isn't it? It's the effect of. But absolutely agree. Franklin, did you want to come in on this political parties question as well?
Yes, thank you. I think an interesting and very important question. I would say on the functioning of parties and in relation to corruption and gender, I would probably suggest four things. First, it's important for parties to or work with parties with regards to an inclusive party platform, particularly ahead of elections, how this platform is being developed, not just by the party leader himself, because it's often him but with a more inclusive process. The second, I would say, the importance for the party to consult with various civil society groups, women groups, and any other persons which can help the party to break out a little bit out of its own cycle. And then thirdly, in terms of the inclusion of women in political parties, trying to work with allies as much as possible as well. Not just men, but also other vulnerable groups which can be included as allies in this debate on women, not just as candidates, but also candidates at electable places and candidates then if the party enters into government in executive positions as well. And then the fourth one, I would say, international exposure of parties, so that again, this is being broken up a little bit, and particularly international exposure of parties with parties of the same family, parties of the same alignment, so that there's a bit of peer pressure among party and party leaderships on how to make the parties more inclusive, both in terms of positions as well as in terms of platforms. Yeah, I think that would probably be useful approaches, I believe.
And there's a question as well that's come in about the role of women's wings and whether they could be an active body here to strengthen the work of women's wings. I don't know if Marina, if you wanted to comment on that in the case of Ukraine, if that's relevant.
Yeah, some political parties of Ukraine used women's wings as a channel of communication with women activists at the local level, on recruitment, on trainings, them as volunteers or supporters during the election process, and recruitment of the good candidates from this women and create this women wings. Yeah, honestly, as a gender specialist, I support more gender sensitive and lens of intersectionality of rights than creation of women wings, because it could strengthen the stereotypes that we have all the men's club as political leaders and decision makers, but as we support women, we create these women wings, and women could meet and speak about women related things or about some social problems, and how to support women or how to celebrate Women's Day in March, so, and congratulate women from our political party, because it will translate the stereotypes. So it depends on the context and work of these women wings. If it will be women's empowerment as political leaders, as monitors, as equal participants of decision making, in decision making, it's okay. In case it will be some women's club with less power to compare with men, I don't support this. And yeah, so in Ukraine we have these quotas, as Orton said. So it is a motivation for political parties to recruit more women as political parties members and provide some opportunities for the promotion of the political structure. So we do have this legal ground for women's promotion, but as I said, after the local elections, we observed that some women elected according to the quotas. They refused to be candidates, to be elected members of local councils due to pressure from the side of men from the top positions at the political parties, and the number of women elected after the election was decreased to the women who become members of local councils, unfortunately.
Thanks, Marina. Yeah. There's a question here, which maybe I'll turn to Franklin, about the budget process, including gender-based budgeting approaches, and how this could be strengthened to combat corruption with a gender lens.
Yes, I mean, gender-based budgeting, again, is an issue which, first of all, needs to build upon accountable processes of budgeting and budget execution. So I think it's important to first have a solid foundation on that. And then the second, I would say, is you need mechanisms of verification. So working with accounting institutions, but also working with gender commissions in terms of reviewing budget implementation is important. So I think the interaction between different institutions, building up a system of accountability is a key issue to make sure that, for instance, gender-based budgeting can become an instrument of enhanced accountability and combating corruption. I think it's not something you can do on your own. You need actually to make a network of institutions functional towards achieving a specific output. And I think the best way to do it is actually looking at specific cases. So I see that currently there's a lot of case analysis around the impact of COVID, for instance. So I think these are good entry points rather than generalized analysis for the budget of the state as a whole. I would rather advocate it on specific issues like that one.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
If I may, can I add one sentence? As my role is to bring Ukrainian expertise, let me add. So Ukraine has this mechanism of gender budgeting. It was launched by the Ministry of Finance in January 2019, and of course it's a good as from the initial stage. Gender budgeting is very transparent process, so we evaluate the need in procurement, understand who will benefit. We collect data about needs of men and women. So from the beginning, it is a transparent process, you know, and it's a really good mechanism to avoid corruption, some sites in the procurement, because we will have a clear need and a process and announce the procurement, and then do understand the result, because the demand was clear on this service or equipment or doesn't matter what. And the Ministry of Finance has established this mechanism. Unfortunately, there is no data yet how many public procurements were conducted with the lens of gender budgeting. But I know that the Ministry of Interior of Ukraine included this topic to the gender audit of the ministry, and the security sector reform is some steps forward to compare with other institutions in gender mainstreaming. So we, as we started from the discussion, usually more gender sensitive government is less corrupted due to application of transparent mechanisms in recruitment, in procurement, in promotion, so gender sensitive budgeting or oriented budgeting, it's a good tool for anti-corruption. Absolutely, I do agree with Franklin. Thank you.
Thanks, Marina. We have another question and also just a praise for our conversation being very valuable, which is always great to hear. But back on the question about how do we make this case in the international development world when we're trying to think about, really addressing this in various countries in various contexts. So what questions should international development actors be asking to embed the business case for gender equality into governance programming? So is there something beyond, are there any women in the room or at the table that we should be asking? What should we really be putting forward? Maybe, Ortrun, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. Very, very important question. I would say the second question should be which women are at the table, right? And which aren't. That's an important question. But I also think that we need to look more at what are the effects of corruption on different genders in a country, but also then what are the effects and possibly the negative side effects of anti-corruption policies, right? Do these policies exclude the interests of women? And so something that comes up a lot now is that we often forget, for example, sextortion when we think about corruption, right? And we focus kind of on the more male-centric view on corruption, that it's all about exchanging money and not any other forms of favors. So, really mainstreaming gender into anti-corruption policies, I think, is the next big step that I would say is much more needed. And it's interesting that there's very little guidance on that out there. So it's not done widely enough. But also, I think asking in the countries who are the female anti-corruption champions and who are male anti-corruption champions, and how can we make sure that both of them get equal attention, protection, and also encourage maybe young women or marginalized, especially marginalized people as well, to move forward as anti-corruption champions. Those would be my main points.
It's very helpful. Franklin, do you want to come to that question as well?
Yes, I would put forward 2 points. The first, I think, is in terms of the business case for gender equality. I think is very much a case for good governance. So good governance means a governance which is accountable to citizens and improve public service delivery. And I think these are, as we just discussed earlier, key issues in relation to an inclusive approach. So that would be the first. And the second would be the question like, who are the drivers of change in the country? And we see very often when we speak about anti-corruption champions, accountability champions, very often we see women in leadership positions. There is this saying that when a company is in deep trouble, very often they look for a women leader. Or when a country is in deep trouble, they also look for a women leader. So it seems that when we look at champions, very often women are the one which are stepping forward. So who are the drivers of change in a society? And from that point of view, gender equality is important to include in governance programming.
Exactly. And I'm just looking at the time, and maybe we have got time for one last question. What the question, we've got a question here that looks at Albania, and so an example here about, in a way, how insidious corruption can be, how people may not always be connecting what's happening politically in a country with actually a corruption. And the case here is that there was a data breach where most of the salaries of almost all of Albanian adults working in private and public sectors were disclosed, and it came out that this was a sort of Russian interference example. And so when we, the reaction to this tends to be a sort of a very a national security approach more so than anything else. And so just thinking about how can we work with women in this regard, especially in parliament or with media professionals, with journalists, I guess to try to change some of that narrative that, or make those linkages a bit stronger, that corruption has wider effects. Maybe Franklin, did you want to? It looks like you're ready to go, so maybe I'll come to you.
I mean, it's a fascinating question. It's and a very dramatic situation actually in Albania. I mean, what this example tells us is that corruption is actually, I would say, a security issue of the first degree. It's not just some secondary development issue. It's a security issue of the first degree. And so in this question, what we have here, we have issues around data manipulation, breaches of secrecy, covert operation, and it actually very much along the lines of the conceptual framework of a part of the foreign policy of President Biden, where he actually says we are in a battle between democracies and autocracies. And the Summit for Democracy actually exactly tries to galvanize and bring together democratic governance in terms of how can these democratic forces support each other, because democracy is not something, it's not something which emerges by itself. It really needs to be nurtured, need to be protected, need to be defended. And in this example, it gives a very good a case why democracy really needs to be defended and doesn't happen by itself. And again, as I mentioned before, in terms of champions, bringing women to the forefront in these leadership positions is very important for winning this battle for democracy and against autocracies.
Thanks, Franklin. And I'll squeeze in one last question, and maybe I'll direct it to you, Marina, because of the Ukraine example. But the question is really about that perhaps there's a danger for this tendency for women to be strong anti-corruption advocates, that then men will be used by elites or by men in positions of power or engaged in corruption to further push back against women's political participation and leadership. So sort of like a backlash to women taking on these roles. And maybe you can talk about that example in the Ukraine, Marina.
Yeah, so as I said, this mechanism which Ukraine has established as a monitoring of public procurements and many trainings conducted for civic activists how to monitor it's a really supportive tool and very practical for civic activists to monitor. But as I said, and many complaints of women civic activists were recorded at the local level when responsible for procurement people at the private conversations asked them why are you doing this? You have a family, you have family responsibilities, you better cook than monitor the procurement. No, many people said that I was attacked in oral form. Sometimes I was threatened by physical violence if I don't stop these activities. And even a gender caucus group of parliament conducted some press events to highlight that voters, women voters from their districts who are active in anti-corruption initiatives, they sent them letters with this with highlighting these problems because, as I said, we do have a mechanism how to report the anti-corruption, but how to protect people who report this, both men and women. We don't have clear this protection mechanism, and the women are affected differently. So it's a clear conclusion, and we could collect evidences. So it's important to work with police. How to protect, investigate, community policing mechanism use. Yeah, so it's no. There are many opportunities for security sector reform to make these linkages between anti-corruption, gender mainstreaming to the security reform, and anti-corruption. Because Ukraine focuses on the prevention of domestic violence. But the violence against women at the public places is a hidden problem for security police reform, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to really say a big thank you to you, Audryn, Franklin, and Marina for engaging in discussion today. And again, thank you, Audryn, for putting together this really excellent paper. We've got lots of people who've participated today who I'm sure will be very interested in the findings. And we look forward to continuing these discussions on Twitter, online, in the work that you do, and in reaching out to us at WFD. We're very happy to always engage in this space. So thank you all very, very much for your time today.